I will call together this special meeting of the Board of Finance for Thursday, April 23rd. I appreciate everybody.
This conference will now be recorded.
Now being recorded. I appreciate everybody coming together and all the hard work that led up to this meeting. So I am here in Town Hall, and all of my Board of Finance colleagues are joined in by conference call, as is Jennifer Charneski, who's our Director of Finance. She's actually in her office, so I'm here by myself in Town Hall. As I've said in earlier meetings, this is an extraordinary time, and I hope everyone is staying safe. And as I think Jamie Stevenson did in her Board of Selectmen meeting, she was alone in 206 as I am today, so that I don't have to wear a mask and can hopefully be understood more clearly. But again, I hope everyone is staying safe. So the purpose of this meeting is a couple of things. One is to talk about the 2020-21 budget, which we were in the process of reviewing really when this crisis started, but also talk about a couple of process and governance matters related to the budget process. I guess the first thing that I would say, and I think all of this has been cleared up by some recent guidance from the governor's office, but his office had issued some executive orders, one of which was around the authority of the RTM and the budget process, and I think it had been interpreted for a while that the RTM was to vote to give up its authority and relegate that to the Board of Finance as part of efforts to prevent congregations of large numbers of people. It looks like that's been resolved such that the RTM does not have to do that in any case, and however that is finally decided, I think it has been, but in case there's any remaining uncertainty, my own view is to strongly urge the RTM to retain all of its authority in that regard and continue to do as it's done in the past, which is to play an important role in finalizing our budget and voting for the final appropriation. That said, if there's some aspect of the Board of Finance process that we can change to make the life of the RTM easier as it gets to its approval process once we vote on the mill rate and budget on May 14th, I would certainly entertain suggestions to do that. We are continuing the process of the buddy system with members of the F&B for RTM, and we'll keep doing that as a part of this process this year. But if there's something further we can do, I certainly would be happy to consider all that. This meeting is also going to be focused on the budget and just taking a fresh and close look at it as part of our review. Both of the budgets for the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education were passed before really this virus hit. And now that it's here, things have changed. We have certainly heard from a number of residents and businesses in town that they are facing some significant trouble. We hope it's short term, but it's trouble nonetheless. And so our objective is to come in and take a look at the budget in that light, particularly because so many taxpayers are under pressure or are about to be under a lot of pressure. And so what we are doing is looking at each one of these budgets, trying to see if we could answer the question, what could we do to reduce them further and reduce pressure on our taxpayers given the circumstances that we are in currently. One reminder that I would have for the RTM as it contemplates its process once we're finished, as a set of rules, once the Board of Finance votes for a budget and sets the mill rate, the RTM is in a position to further reduce the budget if it so chooses, but not to increase the budget. That's why I would certainly encourage F&B, as I know they will be, but anyone else on the RTM who's interested in the process, to make sure your voice is heard as part of the Board of Finance review, because once we get down our process and vote, we may end up voting some reductions in this budget. And so making sure we hear from members of the RTM who are interested in that, that's going to be important, because once we vote to put those changes in place, that the cuts are not going to be something that the RTM can reduce through its process or change or restore through its process. So what the Board of Finance has done in the last week is to take a close look at these budgets and to take some guidance from Jamie Stevenson into consideration and into account. And the guidance she gave was we really should consider seeing if we could have a flat budget this coming year versus what we have this year. And so the way she laid that out was to say, what would it take to have a flat mill rate increase? And so a flat mill rate increase would mean that the mill rate that you're currently assigned to pay your taxes would remain the same as it was last year. But you could actually be paying higher taxes, and the reason is that between last year and this year, the grand list has actually gone up because of various improvement projects, other reasons. It's not a valuation increase, like we did the revaluation a couple of years ago, but still the grand list is higher. So even though we would have a flat mill rate increase if we wanted to aspire to that, the fact is that the total amount of tax revenue would be still higher simply because the grand list is higher. So we thought about that and we said, well, maybe we should come up with two scenarios. One that says, what would it take to get to a flat mill rate increase, which is a certain amount of money, but what would it take to actually get a flat dollar increase? In other words, the taxes raised from last year to next year would be the same, and what would that require? So for the last week, the Board of Finance has been thinking about that and trying to understand what could we do to get there. So the first thing that we did was we laid out the budgets that were presented to us by the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education, and we assumed those budgets didn't change, just exactly what they submitted. So the only change that we made was to simply set the mill rate to what the mill rate was this year for the previous budget year. And that mill rate is 16.47. And so if we set the mill rate at that number, what we get to is a shortfall that we would have to make up of $2,569,000. So that's what would happen if we said, look, let's just take all the planned spending and let's just set the mill rate to what it was last year, the year before this new budget. So a $2,569,000 shortfall. So in other words, that's what we would have to either cut or defer in spending in order to keep the mill rate flat. So as part of that, what we decided to do was, look, we're going to have to figure out where to get this money. There are some things that the Board of Finance can do itself that we think is sort of a first step in that process to seeing if that reduction is possible. And let me go through a few of those things, and as we touch on them, I'd like my other members to weigh in and offer any comments on sort of each one of these different levers that we're pulling. So the first lever that we can pull to try and help meet some of the cuts that I just defined or reductions is to say that for the capital projects that both the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education have proposed, some of those projects are what we would consider bondable. In other words, we could borrow the money to do those projects. And the projects that seem appropriate for that are the ones that are larger in dollar amount, I would say more than $100,000, so not small stuff like a computer screen or something like that. But it's also a project that's long lasted. So in other words, it's not a $200,000 repair project and something we might have to do every year, but really something that's a project that is going to last 10, 15, 20 years, kind of like the time period that we would actually bond something. And so we've identified a few of those projects with both the Board of Education and Board of Selectmen budgets. For the Board of Education, a couple of projects met that criteria. And the first one was the refurbishment of the Darien High School tennis courts for $525,000, and then also the replacement of the HVAC system at Holmes Elementary. And so that's about $825,000 total in capital projects that were actually in the Board of Education budget that we would pull out and bond rather than tax for them next year. Similarly, for the Board of Selectmen, we've got a few projects there that meet that same criteria. First is sidewalks for $500,000, conversion of the Norotan Fire Department to natural gas, $165,000, and then the town hall heating project of $170,000. So adding those up, that is a total of $835,000. So $1,060,000 in these projects would be bondable instead of being included in the operating budget. So the first piece of the shortfall target that I mentioned of the $2,500,000 would actually come from bonding these capital projects that are currently in the operating budget. Let me stop there and see if any members of the board have any comments on that as a lever or specifically on the idea of bonding. Hearing no input.
John, I would just point out.
Go ahead.
I would just point out that the number. I think you meant to say 1.6 million.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think these are generally in line with what we've done, maybe just a very slightly more aggressive in terms of the bonding, but seems consistent with the past.
Yeah.
So sidewalks might be the one that's
Yeah, all of those projects are long-term in nature, and since they're long-term in nature, sort of lend themselves to being bonded. The one thing that I spoke to Jamie Stevenson about all of this earlier today, and she pointed out what we all know, which is that this is an ideal time to do bonding and to consider ways to get projects bonded simply because it's a very low interest rate environment. And we, of course, still have an excellent credit rating as a town, so this is the time to do something like that. And so one thing we may want to consider is whether some of the projects that we are not electing or not putting in this bonding category right now, whether we try to maybe widen the net a bit and see if we could catch a few more of these and consider them for bonding that are maybe not quite as long-term as some of these others, but we'll take that under consideration. So, go ahead.
It's Taylor. I was just going to say, when I was going through the list, there was the $500,000 for sidewalk. There's only $5,000 for sidewalk in the public works capital budget. Is that something we could include?
So let's definitely take a look at that. That might, I don't know whether that's a repeat or that's an error in there, that they budgeted twice for that, or if it's the same project. In any case, it strikes me that we would consider those as bondable projects given the length or the duration or the durability of the investment. Any other comments? So we have a couple of debt service items that we could do that could also contribute to savings. So one of these pertains to the interest savings that came about because we refinanced some debt earlier this month. And what that essentially means is that debt that we had on the books resulted in interest savings because we refinanced it, and that reduction resulted in a reduction of interest income that we will have to spend next year that was already budgeted into next year, but we will not have to spend next year. So that net reduction is $292,450. We also have some an idea for capitalizing interest for some bond proceeds that we received as part of the Oxbridge bonding that was also arranged for this month. Let me hand this over to Jim. Jim, if you'd like to go through those two items in a bit more detail, since this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, John. So last week, about a week ago, the town successfully tapped the market for $15 million in refinancing proceeds and $25 million of new proceeds to begin to finance the new Oxbridge School. As part of the, as you said, as part of the refinancing, we generated about $290,000 that'll occur in this upcoming fiscal year, and that's the first number that you referenced. The second number, because the bonds, which were sold at an overall average yield of around 1.4%, because they were sold at a premium just due to the retail interest that was in the, that we saw in the deal, generated a fair amount of premium. And so one of the things that you can do with that bond premium is use it to pay debt service. And in this case, I think one of our opportunities is to use a small amount of that premium to effectively capitalize interest on that project. And so we'd be using a small portion of those proceeds to actually pay for the interest on the bond ahead of the actual project starting and then ultimately coming online in a couple of years. So I think that this is something you typically see in municipal finance as part of larger capital projects. And
so we wouldn't,
so I mean, it's a fairly standard approach.
Yeah, so to be clear, the bond premium was pretty large, like $4 million, is that right?
Correct. There's about 21 million of par amount of bonds, but because of the retail nature of the demand, we generated about $25 million of proceeds.
Okay. And so is it true, though, that, I mean, I certainly see this in the business world, that you can capitalize interest into these projects. You wouldn't do it for ongoing or existing debt, but that's permanent financing once a project's completed, but as part of a pre-completion financing, if you will. This is common practice in your experience as well, correct? That you could capitalize interest like
correct.
this?
Correct. It's an eligible use of the bond premium as well as paying things like cost of issuance and an underwriter's discount and so forth, and it's certainly permissible by all the regs.
Okay. Comments on that? I know that's
So,
not an easy one. Frank?
Well, I'm a little concerned that this looks a lot like funding operating expense, that is to say, interest with bond proceeds. And I'm not sure, for example, that the resolution that we passed to approve the bond issue would contemplate capitalizing interest or
This is
using the pay interest.
This is Jennifer, and I actually had reached out to our bond counsel and asked what the allowable uses would be for that premium, and she did specifically say that we could use it for the first interest payment that will be due in fiscal 21.
Okay.
We didn't say that in the resolution, though, did we?
I don't know specifically in the resolution, but she has written the resolution and has a lot of familiarity with it and said that this is an allowable use. I can reach back to her and have her confirm.
Okay.
Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong. I think in the past, we've certainly taken excess bond proceeds and projects sometimes when we have a little bit left over. And one of the eligible uses, I think, are always you can use those excess bond proceeds to pay debt service.
Yes.
So I think I think we've done that a few times, Frank, in the last couple of years in terms of using some of the leftover bond proceeds. We can either roll them into another project, or we can use them just to sort of pay down debt service in that year.
Right, but these aren't leftover bond proceeds.
Right. In the recent years, what we've done as part of the project cleanups, we've said there's unspent proceeds, and we've applied them to debt service if there was nowhere else that made sense to reallocate it. This is kind of
I totally agree with that. I'm just saying that we don't know at this point that these are excess proceeds.
No, but we do know from bond counsel that this is an allowable use.
Right, an allowable use is something different. Yeah, okay.
But I mean, ultimately, Frank, we will need to come back to market at least once, probably if not twice, to get to the ultimate. And I think it's $6 million, depending on how much state aid we get. So I think we're probably going to need to come back if 66 number, rather than two bond deals to get 41 million, you need two bond deals to get 41.2 million in this case. All depending on how the ultimate cost shakes out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So Jen, you could check on that. That would be helpful.
I will.
Yes, as a general matter, I'm certainly reluctant to defer things like this, but in this unique case, I think the fact is that, one, it's an allowable use of these proceeds, which means that it's fairly common practice to do so. I certainly see it in the private markets and private world. The second is it is an incomplete project, and so it's also not uncommon to say, look, while the project's being constructed, to have the interest that accumulates on whatever debt is drawn down for that project, such that at the moment the project gets permanent financing upon completion, that all of the drawn proceeds plus interest accrued to date becomes part of that permanent financing. And I think that's, again, something fairly common in the private world for any sort of construction project. So it strikes me in this case that if we go down this route and do it this way, it's not a departure from normal practice at all.
I think it's different in the private sector. First of all, this isn't a bridge financing.
Yeah, I
This is
know.
a permanent financing.
Right.
And I just see a commercial project as different. It's just my view.
Okay. Does anybody else have a point of view?
This is Dan. This is Dan. I think if we're trying to outline a scenario in which we're getting to a flat mill rate, and we're using whatever means the Board of Finance has that using this item alleviates additional burden put on the town budget? Or the Board of Education budget?
Okay. Rob, do you have a point of view on this?
I don't.
Okay.
I think it sounds from, I had some conversations with Jim Woods on this. I think it's correct what we're trying to do here. I'm okay with it.
Okay. All right, let's set that aside for a moment. Maybe we'll just tick through a few of these other things and try to come to a final point of view on that one item in a bit. So another area where we gave some thought was in the planned interest income or budgeted interest income. I believe the treasurer had budgeted $725,000 in interest income for the next fiscal year. Do I have that right, Jennifer?
Yes, the Board of Selectmen put it at 725,000.
725, okay. So clearly in the reduced interest rate environment that has come about because of this crisis, that amount is overstated. Our assessment is that $600,000 cut in that to take it down to $125,000 is a good idea, and I think consistent with what the treasurer even has recommended to the Board of Selectmen, if I have that right. So we've incorporated that. It's a reduction in income, which means kind of an increase in the net spending to the town. Another area where we can contribute to this is out of what's called the Board of Finance capital contingency. So the capital contingency now has somewhere north of $800,000 in it. Do you have the exact figure, Jennifer?
864,000.
864. So what we want to do there is take $400,000 out of that account. I think we even had recent discussions that suggested it had gotten overfunded. And so that's an amount, we'd contribute $400,000 from that account to these cuts. And then finally, the last thing that we would adjust is what's called the collection rate. So the collection rate is the percentage of assessed taxes that we expect to collect. And the way that we figured this collection rate for budgeting purposes is to take the actual collection rate of the past 5 years, take an average of that number, and set that as the number, and from that deduct 25 basis points. And so the reason for doing that is to make sure we have a reasonably conservative collection rate assumption. Hopefully we collect 100% and all the taxes come in, but there's always a little bit of cushion in there, tiny bit, just to make sure that we're actually going to collect the full taxes that we're supposed to. Now, what we did in this case, though, was we said instead of taking the average for the last 5 years, we actually went back in time and looked at collection rates from the last crisis in the 2007-2008 timeframe. And so out of that period, we picked out the lowest collection rate in that particular period and said, why don't we take that collection rate, take 25 basis points from that, and use that as the assumed collection rate for this budget. We think that that is a prudent way to go, and certainly was the lowest collection rate we've seen in well more than a decade. And to take that figure and apply our 25 basis point haircut as we've done in the past seemed to us to be a conservative way to go in anticipation of potential collection problems in the coming fiscal year. So just to take a pause where we are in terms of these calculations. So if you take the bondable projects from the Board of Education and Board of Selectmen, the ones that we've pulled out, that's $1,650,000 in savings there. We've taken the capitalized interest, which we can come back to if we need to, but also the interest reduction in the refinancing that we did earlier this month. That totals to about $516,000. We're going to reduce the interest income by $600,000, which is as a negative in all of this, but offset that in part with a reduction in the Board of Finance capital contingency, plus a mild downward adjustment in the collection rate. So what that does, you'll remember the $2,569,000 target or reduction target that I mentioned right at the beginning. If you do all those Board of Finance adjustments that we just talked about, it comes down to a target cut or reduction that we need to come up with instead of $2,569,000, it's $1,323,000. So that would be the further reduction that we would need to do in order to close out this gap and get to what we're calling a 0% mill rate reduction. So that's the number we have as part of this analysis. Now, let me pause there and see if there are any comments on that number or anything you'd like to add before we figure out how to and have a discussion about allocating that and what to do next. Comments?
Well, I'd like just to remind everybody that as we lower the assumed collection rate, keep in mind that delinquent taxes become an asset to the town. In other words, we're extremely likely to collect that money in the next 5 years or 6 years at a pretty high interest rate. I mean, we do some write-offs every year, but it's almost entirely the automobile and personal property taxes. It doesn't come from our basic real estate taxes, and they're small amounts. So, certainly the interest coupon on that delinquent taxes tends to pay for the any ultimate delinquencies.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, these taxes are due and payable, and you can't get away from paying them forever. You do have to pay property taxes, and that's unfortunately the cost of civilized government, I think, to paraphrase someone who mentioned all this before. But to Frank's point, they do create a deferred tax asset, if you will, that we'll eventually collect, whether we get it now or get it later. But I think the reason for assuming a reduced collection rate now is just in anticipation of potential problems, but also to recognize the fact that we'll need the money for the proceeds for next year, right? And even if they're eventually paid, if they're not paid next year when we need them, we still need to have cash from some source. So having a mildly lower collection rate will help us ensure that we raise the taxes that are necessary. So, other comments or questions?
If I could go back just for a second to the question of using the premium.
Sure.
One of my questions would be, the bond proceeds, do they generate interest income to us, and how is that treated if it does?
This is Jennifer. Yes, the bond proceeds will generate interest income, and that would be considered general fund interest. In the environment that we're in right now, it will be a very minimal interest income on those proceeds as we draw them down.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other comments or questions?
John, I would just add just a couple of things. I actually think this is a really sound approach to this, and I kind of focus on those last, especially 3 items. You know, we're taking down the interest income roughly 85%. We're taking little less than half of the Board of Finance piece of the bonding, and then when you look at the assumed collection rate, we're basically taking it down to the rate of during the financial crisis. So I think those 3 items, especially to me, have history to them. We're not overreaching, lack of a better word, and we have a good sound approach to it. So I appreciate the thoughts behind all of these items, but especially those last 3.
Okay. So with the remaining $1,323,000 in reductions that are required to get to this 0% mill rate increase, we actually allocated those between the Board of Education and the Board of Selectmen. Jim, do you want to describe how we came up with the percentage allocations?
Yeah, John. So what we did to come up with the adjusted, kind of pre-allocation budget was look at the net operating budget of each board, and add to that their capital budget, reduced by the amounts that the Board of Finance would otherwise go out and bond should those projects move forward. So in each case, it's the operating expense plus capital budgets less the items that were bonded, and then we looked at what the relative size of each was. And when you look at the Board of Ed operating budget of $103 million and change, and their net capital projects the capital projects of $1.4 million less the 800 that's being bonded, so plus 600. That's a total budget of just under $105 million. And on the Board of Selectmen side, they had a $34.5 million operating budget with $3.9 million of growth capital projects reduced by $800,000 that we'd go out and bond, produced a net budget of just under $38 million. So basically, looking at $104 million of an adjusted budget for the Board of Ed and $38 million of an adjusted budget for the Board of Selectmen. So that shook out to a 73.4% allocation to the Board of Ed and 26.7% allocation to the Board of Selectmen.
Okay. So that means that of the $1,323,000, the reduction that we would seek, again, in the spirit of trying to meet this 0% mill rate increase, would be a reduction of $971,000 from the Board of Education and $351,000 from the Board of Selectmen. Now, the nature of this is not to say that we're going to cut these budgets by that amount. Really, the purpose of this discussion is to try and be responsive to what we've heard, which is taxpayers are under a lot of stress. The first selectman has asked, could we get to a 0% mill rate increase? There's a number of towns in kind of our group of towns that are aspiring to the same thing or have already done so. And so I think it's incumbent on us as a Board of Finance to say, well, if we're going to get to a 0% mill rate increase, this is what it's going to take to get there. We've pulled every lever we can think of at the Board of Finance level to help accomplish that. And these remaining reductions are what's left over, if you will, to get to that. So we will definitely go ahead and do the Board of Finance changes. That's something that we as a board can just do ourselves. But what we'd like to suggest to the Board of Education and Board of Selectmen is to take these two reduction amounts and go back to your individual boards and see what's possible. What we're really interested in learning is whether some or perhaps all of that cut is possible or that reduction is possible. We'd like to know that. But if, in your opinion, you feel that the services that you provide or the assets that you maintain would be unduly impaired if you went down that route and made those cuts, we'd like to know that too. But this really is an attempt to get a reduction target out there that would help us meet the objective of a 0% mill rate increase. And we want to see what you think. We'd like both boards to go back, think about those reductions, and let us know how you would do it, and give us your assessment as to whether again, as I said, the services or assets that you have would be, whether you could keep going with that kind of reduction or whether you think it would be imprudent to do so. So that would be the challenge that we will put before both boards. Now, I mentioned before that we had two potential scenarios. So one scenario would be to do a reduction to get us to a 0% mill rate increase. Another one would be to get to a flat dollar budget versus last year. So that reduction is going to be a little bit larger. So instead of the $1,323,000, in order to get to a flat dollar budget, that's larger. That's $2,225,000 to do that. And obviously a bigger reduction would be required. And so to apportion those two, that much larger target between the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education, using the same percentages that Jim described, it would be $591,000 for the Board of Selectmen and $1,623,000 for the Board of Education. Whether it's flat mill rate or flat budget, these are big numbers that both boards would have to come up with, pretty substantial, and we recognize that. But we feel obligated to ask the question, if you did pursue a reduction like that to help us get to either a flat mill rate or flat dollar budget, what would it take to get there, and could you do it? And if not, why not, right? What's bad about that, and what would be the reasons that you could not do that? We'd very much like to take that into account in our deliberations, which we will undertake in May. But what we want to do is to lay out those targets for both boards, let you consider them, think about them, and then let us know through our budget review process what you think is possible and prudent versus what you think could be difficult or even unwise and unfounded in terms of any kind of reductions to those budgets. One of the things that Jamie Stevenson mentioned as part of all this is how to think about these reductions. So Both budgets were submitted to us early in this process as the best budgets that they could produce at that time. And I take that seriously, right? In other words, what that means is these budgets were trimmed down a lot, right? There's not a lot of fat in these budgets in either one, in my view, and certainly as both boards represented to us as part of their initial presentation. And so this is less about cutting budgets and more about looking at things that you can defer until later. So the big things to defer are new projects, right? So if there's new capital projects, new initiatives you're undertaking, new hiring, new investments in replacement equipment, any of those types of things that you could say, yes, we'd planned to do that next year, but tell you what, we can defer that. We don't have to do that this year. We'll do it next year or some year into the future. Because if you can do that, what that means is we're not laying off people, we're not curtailing services, we're not damaging the town. We're simply saying some things that are maybe new or renewal type projects. We're just going to say we're just going to defer those for a year. So I would urge both boards that when you're looking through this is to focus on those types of reductions, deferral reductions, as opposed to cutting people, cutting services, and cutting into the meat of what we provide as a town for our residents and for our students. So I think that's Jamie, the way she articulated it is good, and that's certainly something that I subscribe to. Let me stop there and see if anybody else on the board has a comment in that regard or on these targets and reductions.
John, it's Dan. I'd only add that if either board believes there are capital projects that can be bonded, and we collectively believe they should be bonded, I think we're happy to add those projects to the list that we've already identified. This was meant to be a thoughtful list, but not necessarily an exhaustive list.
Yeah, good point. And I mentioned that to Jennifer earlier today, that this issue of could we be more aggressive in bonding projects than maybe what we've done here. It's a good idea, and we will take another close look at those projects and see if there's some ones that maybe we could squeeze into some bonding that we might not have otherwise. Other comments?
Yeah, John, go ahead, Frank.
John, I spoke with Jim today about items in the budget. Both the ECS and ECR grants, the last tranches of those will be fully funded by the state. I was party to a conference call with the CFO of the Department of Education, and she assured us that would be true. Also, nobody is running any transportation right now, so there should be significant savings with this. And however, the governor's executive order seminar pretty much intimates that you have to pay 70% of that expense. So that should be calculated from the budget, and that should save several $100,000. Also, the treasurer informs me that you will exceed your budget this year by a couple $100,000. And also on the Board of Select side, you mentioned no new hires. That brings up the issue of the civilian dispatchers in the police department.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things that just philosophically, I think maybe we would defer to those boards is so when we think about these deferrals or reductions in spendings through deferrals, I certainly have ideas as to how I would do that, but as I try to remind myself, these kind of policy matters about how you spend money, particularly for the Board of Education, since how they spend their money that we give them is really their exclusive purview and not subject to review, I would really leave that ball in their court. So if both boards, however they want to pursue the spending decisions that would be required to meet these deferrals, then I would absolutely leave that to them. Those are certainly good suggestions they should listen to, but really it's up to them to come back to us and let us know what they think as a matter of their responsibility that they would recommend to us. It's our job, though, to come in and say what we think the town can afford, and that's the purpose of this discussion. Other thoughts?
True, but some of these are savings that can be realized in this year that could increase our fund balance.
Correct.
I don't want to see them taking what excess that might occur this year and spend it and, not be responsible citizen, I guess, for lack of better word.
Yep, duly noted. Good point. What else? Any other comments?
Well, I was going to sort of make the same point that we're assuming that there's no savings from this year that would go into the fund balance, and if we realize some savings, we might want to think about how we use those savings next year. And then I wanted to say, on the Board of Ed side, probably more than the town side, there are likely to be COVID-19 expenses that were not in the budget originally, obviously. And, I just think we need to be kind of mindful of their needs going forward in terms of when they come back to us with the action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The fact is that in these sort of coronavirus times, there's a whole lot of unknown unknowns, as was once said, that we just don't know about. We have no idea whether those what different types of expenses might come up as a result of that, and I think we need to be mindful of that. Both boards might actually have a more refined point of view as to what some of those risks could be, and we ought to consider those when they come back to us to make sure that next year is adequately funded, at least to a degree, in anticipation of those needs. Good comments. What else?
John, there are also FEMA funds available for expenses. We can ask Jamie if any application is made for those.
Good point.
Jamie's on the line if you want me to answer that.
Sure, Jamie, if you'd like to, please.
Sure. We are most definitely going to be preparing applications for FEMA funding and any other funding sources available to municipalities for COVID-related expenses. There will be some things that will not be eligible for FEMA reimbursement. And we're certainly looking forward to the governor hearing whether FEMA will reimburse at the traditional 75%. He's asked for 100% reimbursement, but we haven't heard that yet.
And what type of expenditures would be eligible for reimbursement?
Jen can probably answer this too. It would be anything related to a first responder response to mitigating the crisis, but probably not things like expenses related to our virtual meeting platforms or new technology that we've had to purchase in order to facilitate distanced meetings, for example.
Okay. Other comments from anyone?
Hey, John, it's Jim. Just, I think one thing I would point out in here, back to like determining the allocations and so forth. The amounts that we're asking, like the Board of Ed and Board of Selectmen to look at, like the 970, the 350. I would point out that, not only encourage them to look at things that can be deferred, right, that don't affect services and so forth, but I'd encourage them to look in both the operating budget and the capital budget, because I think it's wrong to kind of presume that, capital is less or more important than certain items inside their operating budget. So to the extent they can arrive at those numbers, those deferrals, those reductions through a combination of capital, non-bondable capital and operating expenses, I think, both of those are equally as valuable as we're trying to go through this exercise of maintaining the mill rate for the residents.
Yep, I agree. That's a good point. Okay, I know that maybe some of this discussion was hard to follow since we don't have visuals that we can show as part of the discussion. We're going to work to see if in future meetings we can have both a video of everybody on the board so that you can see all of us, but to be able to switch between looking at your very good-looking Board of Finance, but also be able to look at these figures as we present them. In any case, after this meeting, we'll make sure that the analysis that gets to these budget savings, this is in a spreadsheet that we'll post, so that both boards can see it as well as members of the public. We would invite comments from both boards as you work through this, but also from members of the RTM and the public at large. If there's some aspect of this on which you'd like to comment or you have suggestions for us, certainly my name and phone number and email is on the town website, but we'll make sure that that's attached to these documents. You're welcome to contact me at any time. So unless there's other comments on these reductions, there's a few other things that are housekeeping related I just wanted to mention. The first has to do with the calendar. So in terms of our review process, so we're in the middle of our analysis, as you know, and we're going to be working with members of F&B to look at these individual budgets. And over the next week or so, I'm hoping that the Board of Selectmen, Board of Education, as well as my members and the F&B members that are working on all this, can spend some time together and try to collaborate and work through some of this as we conduct our more thorough reviews of these budgets. But just as a reminder, we have the following meetings coming up for these purposes. So our first budget work session is going to be on May 5th, and it's going to cover selectmen budgets for police and building control, public works, and parks and rec. So those will be the budgets we discuss on May 5th. On May 7th, we're going to talk about community and environment, human services, library, debt service, and general and miscellaneous and other revenues. So that's another piece of the budget. Again, it's all the Board of Selectmen budget. On May 12th, we're going to finish up with those other elements of the Board of Selectmen budget that include general government, fire departments, and all other protective and emergency, capital projects, fund balance. That's also the day that we'll be discussing the Board of Education budget. So those 3 dates, May 5th, May 7th, May 12th, are going to be the Board of Finance review dates. And we certainly, going into those meetings, will make sure we have perspectives from both boards as well as members of the F&B that are working with us. Our last vote before we hand the budget and mill rate off to the RTM is on Thursday, May 14th. On Thursday, May 14th, it's a regular monthly meeting for the board. We'll have a final budget vote that day, and we'll vote to set the mill rate, and that budget and mill rate will then go to the RTM for their consideration and further reduction if they so see fit. So back to these targets and in terms of when we'd like to hear from the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education. So from the Board of Selectmen, it would help if we could get your perspectives on these deferral amounts and what you would do with them and what you'd recommend to us by May 1st. So if we could have that by May 1st, that means that we could have that incorporated into the discussions that we'll have beginning on May 5th, which are the Selectmen budgets. For the Board of Education, we'd like to hear back from you by May 6th, because then on May 12th, that's when we'll be discussing the Board of Education at our budget review meeting, and we can consider all that at that meeting. So I think with these 3 meetings, and if we could have feedback from the Board of Selectmen by May 1st and Board of Education by May 6th, I think we can take all of this into account and get to a final decision on the budgets and the mill rates, a decision that's going to make sense for taxpayers who are under pressure, but also doesn't impair town services or town assets in any unwise way. That's also something we want to avoid, but we want to strike the right balance between those two. I think if we can meet those deadlines, then we'll be in a good position to get to May 14th and be able to vote on a budget and a mill rate that strikes the right balance and makes good sense for everybody. A couple of other comments. I know I've received some comments about just the Oxridge Elementary School, which is a process underway. I think that whatever we decide as part of this, and I know we're looking at both capital and operating expenses, this is just me talking, other members can chime in as well, but my recommendation is that we should not interfere with or delay that process. I don't think we're at a point where something like that needs to be stopped or delayed in any way. Even though it's an expensive project, this is something that we've needed for a very long time. The process that's in place is pretty thoughtful, and to derail that or postpone that would cause actually a lot of trouble that would be hard to deal with and manage. That plus the fact that as a timing matter, even though it's difficult in terms of the town situation, this is actually a much longer term project that has very little to do with the short term. And as such, because of the current environment, it's actually a great time to borrow money and to engage in construction projects. And so as a philosophical matter, I think we should keep the Oxridge Elementary School project in place and progressing as it is today. It does get to the point, though, that this is a great time to borrow money. One thing I want to give the public some assurance about is that despite the fact that we're in the middle of this crisis, Darien retains its top bond rating with both agencies, and that's evidenced by the fact that we had a very successful bonding effort just this month. And as part of all that, we were able to refinance debt, as Jim mentioned, and take out a significant amount of debt service. Moody's has reaffirmed our AAA rating, as I mentioned, and actually for this particular effort for the Oxridge, the new proceeds for the Oxridge School, the $25 million that Jim mentioned, that offering was heavily oversubscribed, 3 to 6 times on some maturities, according to a summary that Jen sent me. The reason I say all this is just to give the public some confidence that even though we're looking at trying to make some reductions through deferrals here to help the taxpayers, the town is in no way under financial duress or stress, and folks should not worry that the town is facing a situation where we might run into trouble. There's no evidence on the short or medium term that that's going to be an issue for our town, and I think everybody should have some confidence in that. I'd also point out that we, of course, have our fund balance in place. Fund balance, as a reminder, is the main reserve fund for the town. It's something that we have in place that in the event of an emergency, when we need funds available to support town spending because of either a disaster with tax collections or some significant expenditure that we need to fund that was not foreseen, that's the reason that fund balance exists. So the balance of that right now is about $23 million. A while back, the Board of Finance set a target that fund balance should be no lower than 12% of our budgeted annual revenues. So what that means is that our fund balance actually has an excess in it right now of about $5 million. So again, if worst comes to worst, that we really do need sources of funding to help the town, we have a large fund balance of $23 million, and $5 million of that is readily available because it's above our 12% floor. So everyone should take away some confidence in the town's finances. This town is extremely well managed, both by the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education. We've prudently managed our expenditures for a very long time. We don't have debt that's overly significant in terms of what we can pay. And we have both good reserves in place to protect ourselves as well as an excellent credit rating with Moody's should we need to borrow more in the future. So all in all, I think very good news for our town as we try to navigate this crisis. Any further questions or comments from the rest of the board? Okay. So that's what we wanted to present and discuss tonight. As I said, sometime tomorrow we will get the materials posted on the town website so that if anyone wants to take a closer look at our analysis, it's available. And we'll make sure we get these deferral targets out to both the Board of Education and Board of Selectmen. And we invite them to analyze their own situation, get back to us with their point of view in terms of what's possible and prudent versus what's imprudent and inadvisable. We want to hear that as well, and we will move this process forward. But I appreciate everybody convening for yet another meeting. We look forward to the next discussion, which will be our first budget review session on May 5th. And again, I would invite anyone in the public or RTM or any of the other boards with any questions about this process to give me a call at any time. And if we need to convene another Board of Finance meeting to discuss or revisit any of this, we certainly will. That's about all I have to say. Anything else for the good of the order? Hearing none, may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, Rob, second. Jim? Okay.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Again, thank you very much. We stand